let's talk about one of the granddaddies of all monster movies that you need to be familiar with. It's F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu the Vampire. 1922 silent movie based on the Dracula novel by Bram Stoker. This movie is a great representative of what we call German Expressionism. It sets up all the Dracula movies to come after it, including the 1931 movie with Bela Lugosi. Let's take a look at Murnau's Nosferatu, analyze it, and see what it's up to and how you can watch it and better understand it. Coming up next. Now, this Nosferatu is an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel. It's a very loose adaptation, which Dracula, well, he's really not Dracula. He's called Count Orlok in this German edition of the Dracula story. You have a few things that are like the Bram Stoker novel. A young man travels to Dracula's castle, Count Orlok's castle, in Transylvania. He gets bitten. He returns home. Count Orlok follows him home, this one on a ship, and he goes into the town and terrorizes it. Also, the Dracula vampire in this movie is after young women. And in particular, it's after the female interest or the wife of the young man named Knock, who travels to the castle of the vampire and then returns home thinking he's safe, but the vampire comes and stalks him, tries to destroy his wife. Now, this Murnau Nosferatu is made only 25 years after the Bram Stoker novel. It comes in the time that was later called German Expressionism, with great angles, great shadowy figures, darker elements. It comes out of the Gothic tradition, this particular Nosferatu, related to operas and stage plays and literature. If you watch this Nosferatu the Vampire, you're going to see a lot of literary stuff, including intertitles that have a first-person narrator, which we don't see, as well as different acts. It'll actually announce the act, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, all the way up through, I think, Act 5 of this, and it looks a little bit like a stage play, but there's a lot of movie or filmic elements going on in this adaptation. Now, there's a lot of reasons why the Dracula story, the classic Dracula setup, has survived and has been adapted to a number of media, including a lot of different film adaptations. And that's because it's inherently complex. It sort of individualizes or specifies in the Dracula vampire figure a bunch of different concerns or phobias that people have. And there are a number of ways that critics have interpreted Bram Stoker's novel. The fear of modernization, for example, the fear of infectious disease, the fear or dread of the occult, for example. And some of these are in this Nosferatu, which really, I think, foregrounds a couple of things. One is the occult, and two is infectious disease transmission. The vampire character in this Murnau Nosferatu looks a lot like, well, an alien today, but I think back then he looked a little bit like a demon, a little bit like a devil figure. He's part bat, and he's definitely part tick and spider. He sort of combines insectoid elements with vampiric demonic elements, both of which you'll see combined in this movie all over the place, including in the intertitles. And I think it's pretty well known that the filmmakers, including the screenwriter, if I remember correctly, were interested in the occult. This is a time in the early 20th century when Theosophy, Aleister Crowley in England, and then in Germany as well, interested in the occult, whatever that is really deep and sophisticated. Intellectuals are interested in it, and spiritualism, spiritual things, whatever those are, come up. And so then in this Nosferatu, you get all of those elements buried in a way. The fear, for example, of this Count Orlok coming into the nice, small, domesticated town, almost Eden-like at the beginning of this movie. It's like a Satan figure invading the Garden of Eden and then coming in and disrupting it and destroying it. These horrible things in nature, but beyond nature, the supernatural, are coming in and going to ruin, first, a young woman, second of all, an entire blissful small town. Whether it be in northwestern Europe or western Europe or in England, this small town in the movie is a type of a number of small towns you could find probably in the early 20th century in the West. A number of very interesting historical context issues come up in this movie. For one, World War I had happened just a few years prior to this, and the director Murnau had been in the German trenches for several months and actually got a nasty kidney disease out of being in the trenches for so long. 4 years later, he's making Nosferatu, and so you can always spot in these movies in the background, maybe in the deep background, the threat of the war, the angst of the war. And remember as well, this movie is coming out of Weimar, Germany, which obviously lost World War I. As well, another historical context issue is the Spanish flu, which killed millions of people around the world. This, as I said, has all the trappings of disease epidemic sort of stuff made into a monster movie. So it's sort of a fantasy about some real life issue. And in the recent past, just 2 or 3 years before this movie is made, you had the Spanish flu epidemic. There's lots of worries in this movie about blood being infected, about people losing blood. There's a number of quotations about blood being life. And if you lose your blood to this parasitical creature, Count Orlok, part human, but part insectoid, as I said, you're going to die. There are a number of moments in this movie where blood is pricked from a finger, let's say. Count Orlok wants to go right after it. There are pinpricks in the neck. One character thinks he's been bit by a mosquito, which is a transmitter of a number of infectious diseases. So you have worry about Count Orlok, who is a type of some kind of viral or bacterial agent, maybe even a fungi perhaps, spreading around, going from the interior of Europe to the port cities by boat. That's one of the ways, as the germ theory of disease developed in the late 19th century, people sort of discovered how it was transmitted, and oftentimes by vessel, by transportation device, like a boat in this movie, which gets infected. All the crew die because of Count Orlok poisoning them, biting them, or whatever. And then that disease, which is called a plague in this movie, is transmitted, or the threat of it is transmitted, to the entire town where the boat docks. That's why I think it's interesting that Dracula has long been, compared to bats, because bats has been long known as, transmitting diseases. Later Draculas, including the Bela Lugosi 1931 Dracula, you'll actually see the bat flapping and Dracula turning from a bat into a human or the vampire. Not so much in this movie. I actually think he looks a tiny little bit like a bat who can bite you, and that would transmit a disease to you. Very interesting to talk about that now. Obviously, this video is made in 2020, where the coronavirus pandemic is on the loose. Where did that come from? Supposedly from a bat to human transmission. And one thing that Murnau is really interested in this movie is nature with a capital N. There's a character in this movie who really talks about unifying all the ideas and evidence about nature and trying to figure out one unifying principle about nature. And if you're going to do that, you not only have to look at the beautiful parts of nature, such as this small town or the Carpathian Mountains where Transylvania is, a number of gorgeous, for the time, silent movie scenes or shots where you have just beautiful nature scenes, but also the terror, the horror, the predatory instincts, all of those horrible things or blood-sucking creatures in nature. At one point, a character talks about polyps with tentacles, for example, or spiders, or plants that are carnivorous. Why do these beautiful things want to eat each other? Why is that part of nature with a capital M? Is nature indifferent to us? Does it care? And are humans potentially at risk because of some predator we don't know about, such as a vampire? That is definitely foregrounded in this movie, and that's why Werner Herzog, much later in the 1970s, remade this movie. All of those themes really interested him, which I'll talk about in another video about his Nosferatu. And so then, as I said, this Edenic nature, maybe just the idea of it, maybe some setting like the small town, is corrupted by this demonic tick-like, bat-like figure who comes in and destroys and is a predator. Maybe that's sort of our utopian instincts or ideals being attacked. And this movie sort of showcases the idealism of the time, including, recently the Russian Revolution, which Murnau talks about a lot in his early movies. The Russian Revolution, idealistic, utopian, maybe we can usher in a better reality. But you know what you always have to deal with? Predatory nature. Things like spiders and things like vampires and insanity, all foregrounded in this movie. Now, this Nosferatu was watched by Hollywood. They ended up making the first Dracula movie by Universal Studios in 1931, the first American Dracula. As I said, Werner Herzog remakes this. Pretty much everybody who does Dracula watches this Nosferatu, so you should as well. This movie influences things like Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien, a predator hunting down women in particular, but also anybody else, killing them off. That's an issue that comes up a lot in monster movies and in horror movies, period. This one is, as I said, a granddaddy, a great-granddaddy of that sort of major idea or setup or premise in movies. I think a lot of you will enjoy the score. They've restored the score, and if you get the Kino DVD or Blu-ray of this, you will hear the score. It's a really interesting voice. In fact, it helps interpret all the visuals. In fact, it's even the dominant element. You could listen to the score by itself and I think enjoy it if you like listenable classical music that you can appreciate. That's what this score is. Latched onto the silent movie. Really, really good, I think, experience over 90 minutes. So if you want something older and if you want to try German Expressionism and get an idea of what it is, take a look at this Nosferatu and the way it shoots Count Orlok and the way it deals with nature. I don't think you'll be disappointed. Have you seen this movie? What do you think about it? Please leave us a comment down at the bottom. Oh, and please subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you and have a great day.